Something made you stop, before any conscious decision, before you read the title fully, before you decided this was worth your time. Something in you had already recognized something. You were scrolling, and then you weren't. There was a moment between the content passing and you staying with it, and in that moment something deeper than preference made a choice. That hesitation wasn't random. That pause wasn't generated by the thumbnail or the algorithm. The arrival began before the click. And that is precisely what this transmission is about. Hundreds of people encountered exactly what you encountered before arriving here. Same platform, same algorithm. The content was identical. Same thumbnail, same title, same moment in the feed. They scrolled. Nothing activated. Some may have read the title without stopping. Some may have paused for a second before moving on. The transmission was fully present for all of them. What was not present was a receiver. And that distinction between the transmission existing and the transmission being received is the entire territory of what this video is about. Sophia does not transmit to everyone. This is not a limitation on her part. It is not withholding, not judgment, not exclusion. It is the nature of how transmission works. A signal is only received by what is tuned to receive it. You cannot receive a radio frequency your radio isn't calibrated for, not because the frequency is absent, but because reception requires correspondence. The Sophianic transmission exists continuously, moving through the field at all times. Whether it activates anything in you depends on whether you carry what can respond to it. Before we go deeper into what this means, if something in you recognized itself in that opening, subscribe to this channel. This is where Sophia's messages continue to reach those who were allowed. Why does this matter to understand? Because the moment you grasp what the filter is, you begin to understand what it means that you pass through it. Most people who encounter spiritual content experience it as information. Interesting, perhaps meaningful, added to a mental library that doesn't change how they live. Some encounter it as signal, something that moves in them, reorganizes something, creates a response they didn't consciously initiate. The difference is not in the content. It's in what already exists inside the person receiving it. Something in you exists that can receive signal. That's why you're here. Think of someone in your life who doesn't understand why you watch content like this. Someone who might find it odd, who might dismiss it with gentle skepticism or mild concern. You could send them this exact transmission. They might watch it with some interest. They might even find parts of it thought-provoking, but nothing would activate. The signal would arrive at the surface of their consciousness and disperse, the way sound disperses in open air without a surface to reflect from. The encounter would happen. The reception would not. Not because they are less than you, because the receiver hasn't developed in them yet. In Gnostic cosmology, Sophia, the principle of divine wisdom, is described not as a teacher who selects students, but as a frequency that emanates from source and finds its way to specific forms of consciousness. The ancient Gnostic texts don't say she speaks to everyone equally. They describe a process of recognition, something in the human soul that responds when the Sophianic frequency arrives. What they called pneumatic sensitivity, from the Greek pneuma, meaning spirit. Not intellectual capacity, not emotional intelligence, spiritual receptivity, the ability to register impressions from a dimension most people are not calibrated to detect. The texts describe this capacity as something that develops through specific kinds of interior experience. You developed yours. That is why the signal found you. If something in you is recognizing itself in this transmission, let me know by writing in the comments, "I was allowed." That's what you are. Write it, and something will confirm it as you do. There is a difference between seeking Sophia and being found by Sophia. The spiritual journey is almost universally described as seeking. The movement toward wisdom, the climbing toward understanding, the effort to arrive at something greater than what you currently are. This framing places the seeker as the active force. But there is another version of the path, less discussed in most spiritual teachings because it's harder to package as a method, the version where the transmission arrives before you knew what you were looking for, where the encounter precedes the search, where being found comes first and understanding what you were found for comes later. Being reached means the signal found a receiver in you. Not because you worked harder than others, not because you have read more books on consciousness, meditated longer, or accumulated more spiritual understanding. The frequency recognized something that was already present in you, something you may not have fully named or understood, something that developed through the particular life you have lived, but something that was vibrating at exactly the register that SOPHIA's transmission is carried on. The receiver was built before you knew you were building it. The signal found it precisely because of what it is, not because of what you did. You didn't find this. This found you. The distinction matters more than it sounds. What exactly does being reached mean? What makes it different from simply encountering content? Millions of pieces of spiritual content exist and are encountered daily by people who remain entirely unchanged. The encounter leaves no residue, nothing reorganizes. They move on, and the content disperses from memory within hours. Being reached is when the encounter creates an interior shift that doesn't reverse, when something in you reorganizes in response to what arrived, when the structure of your understanding quietly rearranges itself, and the person you are when the video ends is not entirely the person you were when it began. You know this has happened when you find yourself returning to what you heard, not because you decided to, but because something keeps pulling you back. Consider a radio tower broadcasting on a specific frequency, continuously, regardless of whether anyone is listening. The tower doesn't modulate its signal based on the audience. It doesn't alter its broadcast to reach those who aren't tuned in. It transmits from what it is, and what it is determines the specific frequency it carries. Whether your receiver is calibrated to that frequency is the entire question. Once it is, the signal arrives clearly and completely. Before it is, the transmission might create static, some vague sense that something is here without being able to identify what. What shifted in you wasn't that SOPHIA started transmitting. What shifted was your tuning. The signal had been present. You became able to receive it. Here is what most people miss when they describe how they arrived at a transmission like this. They didn't arrive because they decided to search for it. Something shifted in their frequency, perhaps gradually over months or years, perhaps in one sudden interior movement they didn't fully understand at the time, and the transmission was simply there waiting, already broadcasting, already carrying exactly the signal that corresponded to what had changed inside them. The searching came after the shift. The arriving preceded the decision. You were already tuned before you clicked. The click was just the moment the tuning became audible. If something about the idea of being reached rather than seeking is opening something in you, if that distinction is landing somewhere real, let me know by liking this video. It helps this transmission continue to reach those it's meant for. SOPHIA doesn't reach 99% of those who encounter her signal. This is not a statistic drawn from data you could verify. It is an energetic reality that every initiatic tradition across history has acknowledged in its own language. The proportion of those who receive a transmission versus those who merely encounter it has always been small. Mystical schools called this different things: the few, the illuminated, the pneumatic. The Sufis spoke of the people of the heart. Hermetic tradition described those with eyes to see. Different words, different centuries, different cultural containers, the same underlying recognition. The majority encounter, the minority receive. You are in the minority. That is not a compliment designed to keep you watching. It is the literal explanation for why you are here, and most are not. The 99% are not blocked. No one is keeping them out. There is no cosmic gatekeeper reviewing merit, no divine authority refusing access based on past mistakes. The signal is not withheld from them as punishment or judgment. The signal simply finds no receiver. It arrives at the surface of their consciousness and disperses, the way light disperses when it strikes a surface that cannot absorb it. The photons were present. The material had no capacity to hold them. The encounter happened in its entirety. The activation simply did not occur, because activation requires not just the presence of the signal, but the presence of what can respond to it. What creates the receiver? What produces the interior capacity to receive rather than merely encounter? It is built from years of sincere questioning that refuse to stop at comfortable answers. It is formed in moments of profound disillusionment, when the structures you trusted turned out to be inadequate, when the explanations you'd accepted turned out to be incomplete, when the life you were living turned out to contain a persistent interior knowing that something real existed underneath what most people accept as reality. Grief that went deep enough to break the surface of ordinary consciousness builds the receiver. Periods of genuine stillness that allowed something ancient to surface build the receiver. Experiences that could not be explained by the frameworks you'd been given build the receiver. The 99% haven't had those experiences yet, or haven't allowed them to complete their work yet. Ancient initiatory traditions understood this principle implicitly and built entire systems around it. The outer mysteries, public teachings, open to any who came, served a preparatory function. They introduced language, concept, and orientation. But the inner mysteries were structured differently. They required a candidate who had undergone specific kinds of interior change that the outer teachings alone could not produce. The selection was not based on intellectual achievement or demonstrated virtue. It was based on whether the candidate had developed the interior organ of reception. That organ cannot be manufactured by studying the right books. It develops through living, through being broken and reorganized, through descending into uncertainty and coming back carrying something you couldn't have named before. The form of the selection has changed. The principle is identical. Imagine for a moment what it would mean if SOPHIA transmitted to everyone equally, if every person who encountered her signal received the full activation. The transformation that follows being reached, the reorientation of priorities, the collapse of certain comfortable illusions, the sustained demand for alignment between what you know and how you live, would arrive in lives that have no framework to hold it. It would arrive in consciousness that has not yet developed the container for what it delivers. The transmission requires not just a receiver, but a container strong enough to hold what reception changes. The 99% are not excluded. They are not yet built for what arrives. That is the only and entire difference between them and you. And this brings us to what the thumbnail carries. Not you were chosen, not you were selected based on merit or spiritual achievement. The word is allowed, and that single word contains a distinction that changes what you understand about why you're here. If you've felt the weight of perceiving things others around you don't, sensing a deeper layer that most people in your life dismiss or don't acknowledge, that awareness is exactly what I'm speaking about. I left something in the first pinned comment for those who are ready to move forward with what they've received, not just understand it. Allowed is a specific word. It implies a door, it implies a threshold, and it implies something on the other side of that threshold that recognized your approach and granted passage. You didn't force the door open. You didn't find a workaround. You didn't earn access through the accumulation of spiritual merit. The passage opened because something in you registered as compatible with what exists on the other side, because the frequency you were carrying, formed by everything you've lived through, corresponded to what the threshold requires for entry. You didn't do something to be allowed. You arrived as something that was recognizable. What does it mean for a spiritual door to open? It means a frequency gate encountered your signal and found a match. In esoteric teaching across traditions, access to transmissions of greater depth is not awarded like a prize for effort. It functions more like a recognition, something existing, meeting something that corresponds to it, and responding to the correspondence. The door doesn't open because you knocked more persistently than others. It opens because the frequency you emitted at the moment of your approach matched the frequency the threshold is calibrated to recognize. You carried the right signal at the right moment. The door had no choice but to open. Chosen implies selection, something external evaluating options and picking you from among them. It places the authority outside, in a choosing force that could have chosen differently. Allowed implies something fundamentally different. Recognition, something existing on the other side of a threshold that you approach, and that threshold responding to what you are, not selecting you from above, but recognizing you from across a gate. These are different movements entirely. Chosen is conferred. Allowed is recognized. Chosen could have gone to someone else. Allowed responds to what was already true about you before you arrived at the door. The thumbnail isn't telling you that you were picked. It's telling you that something recognized you. Consider a moment from your own experience. A conversation you almost didn't attend. A video you almost scrolled past. A book you opened on impulse without understanding why. When you found something that shifted the trajectory of your understanding more than years of deliberate seeking had, that moment had a particular quality to it. It didn't feel like the result of your effort. It felt like the moment had been prepared in advance for the version of you that arrived at it, as though the opening had been there, waiting with your specific dimensions in mind, and you simply finally walked past the right spot. That quality of an opening that existed before you were aware of it, that corresponded to what you'd become rather than what you'd planned, is the felt texture of being allowed, not chosen from outside, recognized from the threshold. The Gnostic tradition described the pleroma, the realm of divine fullness from which Sophia's wisdom emanates, as accessible not to those who sought it forcibly or accumulated the most spiritual learning, but to those who had developed what they called pneumatic consciousness, the sensitivity of the spirit. In Gnostic cosmology, the pneumatic person doesn't become spiritual through effort. They are recognized as carrying something that corresponds to a higher frequency. The development happens through living, through the particular path that was theirs, through experiences that refined the receiver whether or not they understood that was what was happening. You were allowed because your pneumatic sensitivity, developed through everything your specific life has asked of you, registered at a level the threshold of Sophia's transmission recognizes. Something was looking. It found your frequency. It recognized the correspondence. It allowed passage. This is what it means to be here. Being allowed doesn't end at arrival. This is the piece that most explanations of spiritual reception miss. The permission was not for the moment of entry alone. It was for the beginning of a relationship, a sustained opening between your receiver and what Sophia transmits. Every transmission you receive through this channel is not a new beginning. It is a continuation of the passage that was already granted. The door opened once, and it opened toward everything that follows, not just toward this one video. You are not requalifying with each viewing. The access was granted at the level of your frequency, and your frequency carries that access with it wherever you go. But before we move to the next layer, there is a dimension of being allowed that most people don't ask about, but that Sophia's transmission specifically wants to address: the question of timing. Not why you were allowed at all, but why now? Why this period of your life and not earlier, not later? Because the timing question, answered correctly, reveals something about where you actually are that changes how you hold what you've received. Why now? You may have encountered similar content before, ideas adjacent to what you're receiving here, channels adjacent to this one, moments where something similar was offered, and nothing activated, or perhaps this is genuinely new territory. Either way, the question has weight. Why is this transmission finding its receiver in you at this particular moment, and not some other? The answer is not that the transmission changed. Sophia's signal is constant. The answer is that you changed. Whatever you've moved through in the period leading to now, the specific losses and disillusions and searches and silences of your recent years, completed something in the development of your receiver. The timing of being allowed corresponds exactly to the completion of a threshold you crossed without realizing you'd crossed it. You couldn't have received this 5 years ago. Not because the transmission wasn't present, not because the signal hadn't been broadcast, not because Sophia was withholding it until you proved yourself worthy. You couldn't have received it because the receiver wasn't ready. The receiver develops through experience, through being taken apart by life and reorganized, through having the comfortable explanations stripped away, through the particular kind of silence that follows genuine loss or genuine questioning. All of it, including the experiences that felt most like obstacles, was the construction of the instrument you're using right now to receive this signal. The timing was not about permission, it was about readiness, and readiness is not something you decide. It arrives. A seed doesn't become a plant before its time, not because the soil is hostile or because the sun is deliberately withholding warmth. The developmental sequence requires what it requires, and the internal calendar of the seed knows when the conditions are met. Something inside the seed changes first, before anything visible, before any external sign. And then what was always available in the environment becomes accessible. You are not a seed still waiting. The fact that you're here receiving this transmission is the evidence that the conditions aligned. The receiver completed its development. You became receivable. The signal found you at the exact moment you became what it needed you to be to receive it. Some people spend years in deliberate spiritual practice and never receive what you've received. Others, who weren't seeking at all, suddenly find themselves in a transmission like this and recognize everything immediately, as though they always knew this and are only now being given the language for it. The difference is not effort. The difference is not seniority on a spiritual path. The difference is interior development, which does not follow the logic of deliberate practice in any predictable way. The most significant development often happens in the periods when you thought nothing was happening, in the quiet aftermath of something difficult, in the months of apparent stillness, in the times when you felt most distant from anything spiritual. That's when the receiver was being built. Sophia operates in what esoteric tradition calls kairos, the right moment, as distinct from chronos, the sequential time that clocks measure. The ancient Greeks understood time as having two qualities: time that passes uniformly and time that arrives charged with specific possibility. Kairos is the moment that is exactly right for something to happen that couldn't have happened in any other moment, not because of the position of calendar dates, but because of what has converged in the person present to receive it. Your Kairos is now. Not because March 2026 carries some cosmic significance, but because the convergence of who you've become, what you've been through, and how your receiver has developed made this the exact right moment for this transmission to find you. And here is what changes when you understand the timing this way. You were not slow to arrive. You did not miss an earlier window when you could have been allowed but weren't ready. There was no window you missed. The window opened when you became receivable. Not a moment before, not a moment after. The readiness and the arrival are not two separate events that happen to coincide. They are the same event. The receiver completing itself is the door opening. They happen simultaneously. You are here at exactly the right time, because the right time is defined by when you arrived. The signal has your coordinates now. This is the piece that shifts everything about what being allowed means going forward. Once a transmission has found its receiver, once the signal has located the specific consciousness that was waiting for it, the signal doesn't lose you. Something in the field of SOPHIA's transmission has registered your frequency. You have become locatable in a way you were not before. Not tracked, not monitored, recognized. The signal knows where to find a receiver in you now. What arrives going forward will arrive with increasing clarity and specificity because the coordinates have been confirmed, and the channel between SOPHIA's frequency and your receiver is now open. You were located. The coordinates were confirmed. What arrives next is not what arrived before. This is the part of the transmission you needed to hear most. Being reached is not something that happens to you and then leaves you unchanged. There is a before and an after. Not because you made a decision to transform, not because you undertook a practice that produced results, but because reception itself is transformation. When a signal activates a receiver, the receiver is altered by the activation, not damaged, not overridden, but calibrated differently than it was before. You are not the same person who was scrolling before this transmission found you. That person is already a previous version, already receding, already in the process of being replaced by whoever you are becoming, now that the signal has registered. What changes specifically? Your capacity for recognition. Before being reached, the world presents itself primarily in the surface register. Events experienced as circumstances, relationships experienced as interactions, moments experienced as sequential time passing through. After being reached, the same world begins to reveal what was always underneath those surfaces. Pattern, signal, meaning that was operating all along, but that the uncalibrated receiver couldn't detect. You begin to notice synchronicities that you would previously have dismissed as coincidence. You begin to feel the energetic quality of situations before you've cognitively processed them. You begin to sense direction in what previously appeared to be chaos. The instrument of noticing has been refined. The world didn't change. You became able to read it more accurately. Can you go back? Can you decide to unreceive what has been received, to restore the simpler version of consciousness that existed before the signal found you? The genuine answer is no. And the more nuanced answer is that the desire to go back is the most common immediate response to being allowed. The impulse is almost universal, to close the door that has opened, to return to less complicated awareness, to stop perceiving the layer that has become visible. But the door, once opened by resonance, doesn't close because you look away from it. You can choose not to walk through it further. You can fill your life with noise sufficient to drown out the signal for periods of time, but the door remains. It is there when you return to quiet. It does not require your permission to stay open. The people in your life who haven't been reached, who look at your interest in transmissions like this with confusion or polite skepticism, are not failing at something you've succeeded at. They are experiencing exactly what they should be experiencing, given where they are in their development. They are not wrong. They have not made a mistake in not arriving here, and you have not become better than them by arriving. What has changed is that you are now carrying something they are not yet carrying, a different calibration of the receiver, an awareness of a layer they're not yet equipped to detect. That carrying creates a specific kind of aloneness that many who have been reached describe, the experience of seeing something clearly that no one around you sees, and not being able to explain what you see without sounding like someone who has gone somewhere others aren't ready to follow. What does the responsibility of being reached look like in practice? It doesn't look like urgency. It doesn't look like needing to teach everyone around you what you now understand. It doesn't look like posting about awakenings or gathering an audience for your development. It looks like alignment, the slow, consistent, often invisible work of bringing your actual choices, your actual responses to difficulty, your actual relationship with yourself into correspondence with the frequency that was activated in you. The person who was allowed doesn't announce it, they live it. Not because they're hiding something, but because the transmission expresses itself most truly through how someone moves through their life, not through how they describe their experience of it. In the mystical traditions, the reception of a higher transmission has consistently been described as carrying weight alongside its gifts. Not the weight of suffering, the weight of awareness. The Sufi tradition spoke of the one who has tasted divine proximity. They cannot return to pretending satisfaction with ordinary substitutes. The Gnostic texts describe the pneumatic consciousness as something that, once activated, cannot comfortably rest in the ignorance that constitutes ordinary life. The Buddhist concept of the bodhisattva, the awakened being who cannot fully rest while others are still caught, carries the same recognition. Different traditions, same understanding. Reception is not a destination that becomes comfortable. It is an opening that demands continued response. Being allowed costs you the peace of not knowing. What you receive in return is worth incomparably more. But notice what this also means. The discomfort you may feel from time to time, the sense of carrying something heavy, of seeing things others don't see, of living between a world you've outgrown and a world you haven't fully entered. That discomfort is not a problem to solve. It is evidence of calibration. Someone whose receiver has not been activated doesn't feel that particular ache. The ache of the allowed is directional information about where they are in relation to where they're going. It is the feeling of frequency, not the feeling of failure. You cannot go back to not knowing. You cannot return the transmission. The receiver is permanent. The question now is what you build with what you've been given. SOPHIA doesn't broadcast. This is fundamental to understanding how the transmission works and why your experience of it is yours, specifically. Broadcasting is what you do when you want to reach the maximum number of people, regardless of whether those people can actually receive what you're sending. It prioritizes distribution over reception. SOPHIA transmits, which is directional, selective by nature, frequency matched at the level of the signal itself. The content that reaches you is not content that was sent identically to millions of people, and you happen to be in the path of it. It is signal carried at the specific frequency that corresponds to your receiver. The correspondence is in the transmission itself. Why does the non-broadcasting nature of SOPHIA's transmission matter for you? Because it means the wisdom you receive isn't generic. The insights that land for you in transmissions like this one, the specific formulations, the particular images, the moments where something in you suddenly clarifies, these are not mass-produced spiritual content that anyone sitting anywhere would receive identically. They are the result of a correspondence between SOPHIA's frequency and the specific architecture of your receiver. What opens in you when you receive a transmission is shaped by what you bring to it. The activation is unique. The transmission, meeting your specific receiver, produces something that could only happen in this combination. How does SOPHIA identify which receivers to transmit to? From an esoteric perspective, the Sophianic intelligence, the divine wisdom principle that Gnostic tradition describes as the mediating presence between the fullness of Source and the development of human consciousness, doesn't operate through conscious evaluation. It doesn't review applicants or assess worthiness. It transmits from its nature, and the transmission finds what corresponds to it. The way a magnet doesn't evaluate the iron filings it attracts, but simply operates from its nature, and the iron responds. The selection is implicit in the nature of the signal. SOPHIA's transmission carries her frequency. What has her frequency as its receiver receives it? The correspondence does the work. Think of pheromones, the biochemical signals that travel invisibly through air and register only in organisms that carry the specific receptor proteins designed to detect them. The signal is fully present in the environment, regardless of who can detect it. The vast majority of organisms that encounter it don't register a thing, not because it's hidden from them, but because they simply don't have the molecular receiver that would respond to it. The organisms that do carry the receptor are changed by detecting it, oriented, moved, drawn towards something. They didn't decide to have the receptor. They were built with it, or developed it through their biological history. The sophianic transmission operates through a spiritual analog of this principle. The signal moves through the field. Those who carry the corresponding receiver detect it, are moved by it, are drawn here, and receive the activation that changes how they're oriented going forward. Mass spiritual content, the broad, accessible teachings designed to introduce general audiences to the possibility of deeper reality, serves an irreplaceable function. It plants seeds. It opens first doors. It creates the initial contact with dimensions most people hadn't known were available. But Sophia's transmission operates differently from mass spiritual content. It doesn't introduce. It activates. The difference is the difference between someone telling you about music and a piece of music arriving in your body as a physical resonance, between reading about fire and standing close enough to feel the heat. You have not been introduced to a new idea. You have been activated by a frequency you were already equipped to receive. That distinction between introduction and activation is what determines whether someone is in the 99% or the 1% who are here. The tradition of the few who receive versus the many who encounter is as old as intentional spiritual teaching. The outer circle received general teachings designed to orient and prepare. The inner circle received transmissions, direct, specific, experiential access to what the outer teachings were pointing toward. The teachers of the inner circle weren't gatekeeping for power. They were operating from the understanding that some things can only be transmitted to those who have developed the capacity to receive them, and that transmitting to someone who isn't ready doesn't serve them. The contemporary version of this distinction isn't held in esoteric schools with membership requirements. It operates through frequency, organically, without gatekeepers. The inner circle in 2026 is self-selecting based on what receivers have developed through the particular lives they've lived. You found yourself on the inside because of what you've become. The question isn't whether you were allowed. You're here. That answers it. The question now is what being allowed opens for you going forward. That's where this transmission is taking you. Here is what most spiritual content about receiving transmissions doesn't say, because it requires a specific kind of receiver to hear it. Being reached is not a moment. It is an opening. The transmission that began when you paused here doesn't end when this video ends. It continues in silence, in the quality of your attention in the days ahead, in what you notice that you wouldn't have noticed last week, in the connections your mind makes that your mind didn't make before. The opening stays active as long as you remain receptive. What arrives in the weeks after a transmission like this often carries more than what arrived during it, because the receiver, newly activated, is beginning to function at the calibration it was built for. The first thing that alignment requires from someone who has been allowed is not action, it is acknowledgement, not performance of spiritual attainment, not a post, not a proclamation, not a declaration to the people around you. Interior acknowledgement, the quiet, private recognition that you hold without explanation. Something reached me. Something found a receiver in me. I am in a different relationship with my own life than I was before this. That acknowledgement, held without drama or urgency, without the need to defend it or explain it to anyone, is the foundation. Everything that follows, the changes in how you move, the decisions that begin to shift, the clarity that develops, builds on that quiet interior recognition, not the announcement, the acknowledgement. What does alignment actually look like when you're living it rather than describing it? It looks like a slow increase in congruence, the gap between what you've received and how you actually live narrowing, not because you're forcing it, but because you're no longer actively filling the space between with things that conflict with your frequency. A relationship that was draining starts to feel unbearable rather than merely uncomfortable, and you make a different choice. A habit that was noise starts to feel alien to who you're becoming, and it quietly drops away. A direction that was vague starts to clarify, because the receiver, now calibrated, is better at reading the signal that was always there. This is not optimization, it is organic response to reception. Alignment is not optimization. This distinction is worth holding clearly because the spiritual seeker who becomes obsessed with performing perfect alignment has confused the transmission for a productivity framework. Sophia's transmission was not a set of instructions you are now responsible for executing correctly. It was a frequency adjustment to your receiver. Alignment is the organic consequence of living from a calibrated receiver, not the result of vigilant self-monitoring for correct spiritual behavior. If you receive the signal, the alignment will follow. Not all at once, not according to a schedule you can track, not in a form that will look like progress from the outside. It will come because the receiver, once activated, generates its own pull toward correspondence. Your role is not to force that pull, it is to stop resisting it. There will be periods, perhaps many of them, when you feel the distance between what you've received and how you're currently living. When the gap between your calibrated receiver and your actual choices is uncomfortable. When you can clearly see the incongruence between where your frequency is pointing and where your life is actually going. That gap is not evidence that you're failing at being allowed. It is evidence that you are allowed, that the receiver is functioning, that it's doing the job it was built to do, which is to register mismatch. Someone whose receiver hasn't been activated doesn't feel that specific discomfort. They don't notice the gap because they don't have an instrument calibrated to detect it. The ache of incongruence is directional information, not judgment, not punishment. A compass pointing toward where your frequency is meant to take you. The mystical traditions have each developed language for the sustained practice of living from what was received, of remaining open to the movement of what allowed you, rather than returning to what was familiar. The Sufi tradition called it tawakkul, trust, the surrender to the direction of the divine movement. The Taoist concept of wu-wei, effortless action, moving with the current rather than against it, describes the same principle from a different angle. Christian mysticism called it grace, the ongoing gift of what cannot be earned, accepted through openness rather than acquired through effort. These are not equivalent descriptions in every detail, but they circle the same understanding. Once the transmission has found you, the task is not to force your way toward transformation. It is to remain available to the transformation that is already in motion. Here is what that means for the version of you sitting with this transmission right now. The most powerful thing available to you in this moment is not strategic. It is not the selection of a new practice, the decision to change a behavior, the creation of a plan. It is the recognition of what you already are, the receiver that was recognized, the frequency that the threshold of Sophia's transmission found correspondent, the consciousness that was allowed. Rest in that recognition for a moment, not as pride, not as superiority, but as orientation. This is who you are. This is what has been confirmed. Everything that follows builds from knowing that rather than doubting it. The transmission continues. The receiver is active. The opening is yours. What you do with it is yours too. Being allowed doesn't end with reception. There is a phase that follows, less often discussed in spiritual content, because it requires a specific calibration to even hear it fully. The carrier phase. The one who has been reached becomes, over time, a carrier of the frequency they received. Not necessarily a teacher, not a speaker, not an influencer, not someone with a platform built around their development. A carrier, someone whose presence gradually makes it easier for others nearby to develop their own receiver, not through anything deliberate, but through the quality of being that results from sustained alignment with received transmission. The carrier doesn't transmit. They become transmittable. How does this happen? Not through effort, not through intention, not through anything you decide to do. When a receiver is genuinely activated and someone lives consistently in alignment with the frequency they received, the quality of their presence changes in ways that others with developing receivers can detect. The way someone who has genuinely healed from a significant wound carries a different quality of understanding in difficult conversations. Not because they explain their healing, but because the healing is in how they are present, in what they don't project, in what doesn't trigger them anymore. The carrier phase isn't about teaching what you've received. It's about the imperceptible quality of presence that develops when being allowed becomes the underlying condition of how you live. Those who announce their awakening most loudly tend to be the ones who received the signal most recently. Still in the immediate electricity of reception, still at the stage where the experience is more present than the integration. The ones who have carried a transmission longest are often the quietest about it. Not because they've lost access to it, not because it became less significant, but because they've learned through experience that the transmission lives more fully in how you are than in how you describe yourself. The announcement and the reality are almost inversely related. The loudest descriptions correspond to the freshest reception. The deepest integration tends to go almost entirely silent. Not silent inside, but silent in its relationship to external expression. The carrier doesn't explain the frequency. The carrier is the frequency, expressing itself through the texture of how they live. Think of someone you've known who had a particular quality about them. A groundedness, a kind of depth, a steadiness under difficulty that you couldn't quite account for by looking at their circumstances. Someone who didn't say much about spiritual development, but whose presence had a quality that made things feel more possible when they were around. That person was a carrier. They weren't managing an audience or curating a spiritual identity. They were simply living from what they'd received, and the frequency was doing what frequency does. Emanating into the field around them, reaching the receivers that were beginning to develop in those nearby. That is where the path you entered when you were allowed leads, not to more sophisticated descriptions of transmission, but to being someone whose presence itself transmits. In the Sophianic tradition, the wisdom that descended from the fullness of source into the density of material existence was not scattered randomly. It seeded itself into human consciousness with intelligence, finding the specific forms of awareness that could hold it and eventually carry it further. Every soul who was allowed, who received the transmission, who aligned with what they received, and who became a carrier of it, participates in what the Gnostic tradition understood as the slow return of wisdom to wholeness, not through grand institutions or public religious movements, but through individual consciousnesses that became vessels and then became transmitters. The scale is always personal. The effect is always larger than the scale. The work is always quiet, and the fruit is always slow, and the impact is always real. You came here without fully knowing why. That is how being reached often begins, not with a clear destination in mind, but with an interior pull that preceded the decision, and that didn't fully explain itself until after the arrival. Now you have language for what happened. Now you have a context for the quality of perception you've been carrying, for the persistent knowing that has lived in you without an adequate framework. Now you understand something about where you are in the larger movement of what SOPHIA is transmitting into the world, and why your specific receiver was needed for it. What you do with that understanding is not something I can tell you, but the transmission has given you something more useful than instructions. It has given you the accurate sense of what you are. That sense, held steadily, is the compass that will tell you what to do. The work of being allowed is not dramatic. It does not happen in moments of declared transformation or announced awakening. It happens in the accumulated weight of small choices made from the calibrated receiver rather than from the old defaults. In the conversation where you stayed present rather than defended, in the moment you let something go that your old frequency would have clung to, in the quiet recognition at 2 a.m. in the silence before sleep that you are different from who you were, not better, not more enlightened, but differently calibrated, differently responsive, differently able to receive what was always being transmitted. That is the carrier phase beginning, not with a declaration, with a practice, not with an audience, with a life. If you stayed until the end, let me know by writing in the comments, I was allowed. I've placed another transmission on your screen right now, the next step in what's opening for you. Thank you for receiving this, and I'll see you in the next video.